Dreher was born in 1967. He studied journalism, politics, and philosophy, and his career started. It's sort of a root of American conservatism. Started in National Review magazine, continued in Weekly Standard, and all those neoconservative, more or less neoconservative media like Wall Street Journal. He contributed to Wall Street Journal and others, and ended up in American conservative, what is a base of traditional conservatism. Rod he's critical of Donald Trump, what surprised some of us, because he's more critical than we would expect. He is himself, he converted from Catholicism, he converted to Catholicism, and then from Catholicism to Eastern Orthodoxy, what is probably even more surprising for many others. And, you know, there are writers who write books, and he wrote a book you can buy here in the shop. It's called Benedict Dobson. There are writers who write articles, who comment others, and there are writers who do everything from this, and we call them celebrities among us. This is the conservative celebrity, Rod Dreher. Please welcome him and
As a celebrity, I would ask you to please put me on Instagram, and because as recent political history of my country has shown, you can go very far as a celebrity. Thank you for having me here in Bratislava. This is my first time to your city, and I've only been here about 1.5 days, but already I'm so impressed and so moved by the testimony I've heard from people who were in the underground church in the anti-communist resistance. And this is going to be important for my next book. Maybe we can talk about that later. But tonight I want to talk about the Benedict option, my most recent book, which has been translated into Slovak and is in 10 other languages. And I think it's an important book for our time, for Christians, not just Catholics and Orthodox, but also evangelicals and other Protestants, as we try to figure out how do we respond to the challenges of our time. Well, the word apocalypse in Greek means an uncovering. In the more common use, it means total disaster. I think we can all say that the recent fire at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris was an apocalypse in both senses of the word. Happily, it was not a total disaster, though it easily could have been. But it was without question an uncovering for the French people, and not only the French people. That cathedral has stood in Paris for almost 9 centuries, at the heart of one of the greatest cities of the West. And for a few hours on a Monday afternoon, everyone had reason to fear that it would exist no more. A building that had been part of the lives of countless generations of French people was on the verge of disappearing forever. What did the fire at Notre Dame uncover? The fragility and the impermanence of our buildings, obviously. If even that great stone Gothic cathedral in the heart of Paris could disappear, what is safe? More importantly, I believe the cathedral fire unveiled the reality of Christianity's disappearance in France and in the Western world. Our world of Christian faith is burning to the ground, and we do not have much time to save anything from the inferno. The fire brigades are not coming to save us. If the faith that gives us salvation as well as meaning and purpose to our civilization is going to survive, then we ordinary Christians are going to have to be the fire brigade. These are not normal times. We in the West are living through the worst spiritual crisis since the collapse of the Roman Empire. We don't see this collapse clearly because it is hidden by our wealth. But make no mistake, The fundamental pillars of Western civilization are crumbling, and none more severely or more consequentially than the church. Our crisis is actually a combination of crises. First, it is a crisis of meaning. In the West, we have arrived at a place where many people no longer believe that meaning exists at all and that we can know it. The modern historian Yuval Noah Harari says that the world today can be explained by a simple transaction. People have exchanged meaning for power. That is, to gain the right to do whatever we desire with our bodies and with nature, we surrender the idea that objective meaning exists. We are free to do as we like, but the cost of that freedom is nihilism. It is also a crisis of truth. We have lost the ability to determine what is true and what is false. We can no longer agree, all of us, on a narrative that allows us to reason together even as we disagree on smaller things. This is one reason why we cannot solve our conflicts. It is also a crisis of fragmentation. In our time, many people have lost a sense of unity and of purpose. We no longer feel that we're part of a wider community. Radical individualism is the new normal. The old bonds of family and community have mostly dissolved. It is finally a crisis of identity. We have cut ourselves off from God, from our past, from family, from our places, and from any of the traditional sources of the self. We don't know who we are. Today, in the name of freedom, we even deny our biology as males and females. All of these crises are manifestations of what one critic has called liquid modernity. This critic, the late sociologist Zygmunt Bauman, says that the modern condition is one in which everything changes so quickly that it becomes impossible to find stability. The one who thrives in liquid modernity is the one who has no relationships and no commitments. Modern man is not a pilgrim, that is, a man who goes on a meaningful journey with others toward a certain destination, but rather he is a tourist who travels wherever his whims take him. This is not new. In his famous 6th century rule, St. Benedict of Nursia identified this kind of person as a gyrovague and called him the worst kind of monk. He goes from monastery to monastery without stability, taking what he can find and then moving on. A gyrovague is lost. Benedict of Nursia, a religious genius who was never formally trained in theology and was never ordained a priest, is one of Europe's patron saints. It was Benedict whose monastic order responded to the civilizational crisis of post-imperial Europe by embodying a way of life that offered light in darkness and order amid chaos. They did it by putting the search for God at the heart of a disciplined religious community. I am convinced that we Christians who live amid the collapse of Christianity can and must learn from our Father Benedict not only how to endure these new dark ages with our faith intact, but also how to thrive. The rule of St. Benedict is a way of life that offers everything that the gyrovague refuses. It trains communities that live by the rule to discover meaning, truth, community, wholeness, and identity. The rule is a source of life and hope for a dark and confused world, precisely because Benedict wrote it out of his own experience of the collapse of Roman civilization. As a young Christian, Benedict fled from the city of Rome and went to live and pray in a cave in Subiaco, and eventually emerged to found monasteries and to write his rule. When he died in the year 547, there were only a few Benedictine monasteries. But over the next few centuries, the movement grew. Historians credit the Benedictines with laying the groundwork for the rebirth of civilization in the West. How did they do it? Benedict was a Christian who sought a way to serve God in community, amid a world where all certainties and all moral structures were in collapse. The early Benedictine monks did not seek to save civilization or to make Rome great again. They only wanted to put the search for God first and to order everything else in their lives from that. To find God, the Benedictines established a way of life that consecrated everything to his service. Prayer, work, study, worship, eating, living together, all of it was ordered by the rule to keep the members of the community always on an inner, orderly pilgrimage to unity with God. Theirs was a life of constant conversion. The fruits of that conversion were shared throughout Western Europe over the next centuries. The monks did not only stay inside their monasteries, but rather they became a blessing to all the people around them. They taught them how to pray most of all, but they also taught them how to cultivate gardens, how to build things, and how to do all kinds of things that people forgot after Rome's collapse. And within the monastery libraries, the monks, as scribes, preserved the cultural memory of Greco-Roman civilization. Now, what I call the Benedict option is the choice that all Christians must make if we want to hold on to our faith in this age of darkness. Christians today must understand ourselves as exiles and develop ways of living that keep the faith alive through this long trial that the church is now enduring. As my new Slovak friend Vladimir Panko says, the lines are coming. Now, the most common misconception of the Benedict option is that it is a call to head for the hills and to build fortresses. This is not true. There is no real escape from liquid modernity. Besides, unless we have a vocation to the actual monastery, we must live in the world. I think we should understand ourselves as like the Hebrews in their Babylonian exile. Through the prophet Jeremiah, the Lord told his people that he allowed them to be carried away into exile in Babylon for his own purposes. It's not going to last forever, he said, but for now, he told them to settle in Babylon and to pray for the peace of the city. But that was not the only thing to know about the Hebrews in exile. If we look at the book of Daniel, we see the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, 3 Hebrews who were the king's servants. Now, you can hardly be more assimilated into Babylonian society than that. But when the king demanded that the men bow down before a golden idol, they chose the prospect of death before sacrilege. Today, we have to ask ourselves, how did those 3 young men live there in Babylon such that when they were put to the test, they chose death, or the prospect of death, before abandoning God? Whatever they did, we also must do in our Babylonian exile. Now, the term Benedict option comes from a famous passage from philosopher Alistair MacIntyre's book, After Virtue. In the book, MacIntyre says that the disintegration of the West has reached a breaking point. He compares it to the collapse of the ancient Roman imperial order. Today, he said, there are those who have ceased to identify the moral life with the maintenance of the contemporary social order. Instead, not always recognizing what they're doing, they will choose to devote themselves to creating new forms of community within which the moral life can be continued in this new dark age. MacIntyre writes that, quote, "We await another and doubtless very different St. Benedict." So what's MacIntyre's point for us Christians? His point is that we face a decision. We can continue to labor to build up this failing post-Christian order, or we can choose to focus primarily on building communities, local communities, within which the faith can survive That's fine. We're not going to be able to count on power forever. Or we could choose to focus primarily on building communities within which the faith can survive this cultural revolution. This is the choice facing us. This is the option: Caesar or Benedict, Babylon or Jerusalem, the culture of death or the gospel of life. Let me be clear. We lay Christians are not monks. We are called to live in the world. But if we are going to live faithfully in the world, then we must spend far more time and effort away from the world in prayer, in study, in fasting, and doing other things to root the faith deep in our hearts. Our spirituality must become more disciplined and, yes, more monastic. Because our calling is to live in the world, we must always offer the gospel in word and in deed to the world. But today, we Christians are weak in faith, and we cannot give the world what we do not have. Believe it or not, I always return to the U.S. from visiting Europe with optimism about Christianity's future. Yes. It is true that Christianity is more popular in America than in most European countries. More Americans go to church on Sunday than Europeans. But one great advantage you European Christians, especially faithful young adults, have over us Americans is that you are not deceived about the seriousness of the crisis. I don't have to convince European Christians that we are in a life or death struggle for the faith. In contrast, it's very hard to convince American Christians about how perilous our situation is. We Americans are an optimistic people, but in this case, this optimism is foolish. Nobody who has examined the literature, the academic literature, on contemporary Christian belief and practice can possibly be optimistic. The faith has been declining over the past few generations, but with the millennial generation, it has walked right off a cliff. Among those millennials who still profess belief in Christianity, what they actually believe is a pale imitation of the historic faith. The sociologist of religion, Christian Smith at Notre Dame University, calls this pseudo-Christianity moralistic therapeutic deism. It's what happens when the bourgeois spirit casts out the Holy Spirit and parasitically inhabits the language and traditions of Christianity. Moralistic therapeutic deism, or MTD, teaches that God exists, but the only thing he wants of us is that we be happy and fulfilled and nice to others. And that's pretty much it. MTD is the de facto religion, not simply of American teenagers, but of a lot of American adults, people my age and older. To a remarkable degree, teenagers have adopted the religious attitudes of their parents. The United States has been an MTD nation for some time now, though that may have been disguised. Christian Smith told me in an interview, quote, "America has lived a long time off its thin Christian veneer, partly necessitated by the Cold War. That is all finally being stripped away by the combination of mass consumer capitalism and liberal individualism," unquote. Now, when we lose our Christian veneer, we Americans have very little left, only the shopping mall. But in Europe, you still have the cultural architecture of Christian belief. I mean that literally. You have all around you the visible remnants of ancient Christian culture. These places, cathedrals, churches, monasteries, pilgrimage sites, relics of saints, are all places of memory. But they might simply become tourist attractions or museums, nothing but dead bones of a dead religion if you don't make them live again. I discovered some important insights from reading the work of Paul Connerton, a social anthropologist at Cambridge University. He wrote a brilliant little book called How Societies Remember, in which he examined small traditionalist societies to discover how they managed to hold on to their traditions in liquid modernity, which dissolves everything it touches. In modernity, the individual conceives of himself as self-determined. By contrast, traditional societies believe that the individual is determined in part by things external to himself, religion, society, the past, and so forth. Our experience of the present, says Connerton, largely depends on our knowledge of the past. The struggle of traditional societies in the modern world is the struggle of memory against forgetting. The more radical a social order's aspirations, the more it will try to control the memories of the people within it. A people that has been cut off from its past, whether they have been denied access to those memories or whether they have chosen to be indifferent to them, is a people that can be dominated. In the case of the church, those who make the Christian life merely about good works or only about the individual's personal experience of God surrender to outside domination and disintegration. The anthropologist Mary Douglas has said that when a religion turns away from its mystical cosmological teachings and begins to focus mostly on the individual's spiritual experience, it is on the way to decline. Then, when it turns to what we call the social gospel, the gospel only of good works, the religion is in terminal decline. It all begins, though, with losing a palpable sense of the sacred, rooted in historic community. For his part, Paul Connerton finds that no culture can exist without shared memories, that is, traditions. So how do small traditional cultures that manage to hold on to their shared memories in the face of modern disintegration do it? Paul Connerton found that they had several things in common. First, these communities have a sacred story that tells them who they are. Second, these communities commemorate their sacred stories more or less by ritual performances. These performances must do several specific things. They must tell the sacred story in the same way. It must be understood by the community that this sacred rite, sacred ritual, in some sense takes its participants out of ordinary time and connects them to past generations of the community. And third, the ritual telling of the sacred story must involve the body. The sacred story, in Connerton's lovely phrase, must be, quote, sedimented into the bones. In this way, the sacred story and all it implies must become a matter of what Connerton calls habit memory. Reading Connerton for the first time, I understood from an anthropological point of view why liturgical Christianity, traditional Catholicism, and Eastern Orthodoxy is so powerful. The beauty and the potency of the liturgy is an incomparable bulwark against the disintegrating forces of liquid modernity. But the liturgy is not a magic spell. As Mary Douglas has written, our culture's rituals express its cosmology, and in so doing, they construct its sense of reality. But that cosmology must also be lived outside the ritual in everyday life. If we all live as if there is a separation of religion and life, we rob religion and the ritual of all its power. Going to the Mass is necessary, but it's not sufficient. The liturgy must be part of submitting our entire lives to what Douglas calls, quote, a total pattern of symbols. Well, let me speak concretely. If we are to sediment the Christian faith into our bones, then we must constantly submit the body to the purification of spiritual life and practice. We have to pray, and pray with our bodies, crossing ourselves, making prostrations, kissing icons, lighting candles, kneeling in worship, making pilgrimages to holy places. These things are not empty gestures at all. They are among the most meaningful things we can do. This is how our sacred story becomes our own. Pope Benedict XVI, the second Benedict of the Benedict option, once said that the best arguments for the faith are not syllogisms and apologetics. Rather, the best arguments for the faith are the saints the church produces and the art that comes from the church's worship and belief. These things are doorways leading to a life-changing encounter with the truth, who is Jesus Christ. We Christians, I firmly believe, do have the answer for what man longs for. We return man to his body and his body to his Lord. We immerse him in beauty and goodness. We help him know who he is and who he will become. We teach him how to sediment the truth into his bones. Pope Francis says that we must evangelize, and he's right about that. If our faith is not evangelical, it's not truly Christian. Our Lord tells us to take the good news to the world. But again, we cannot give the world what we do not have. We have to recover our story. We have to recover our habits. We have to recover our culture. There's no way to do that without a rediscovery of a disciplined spiritual life in communion with others. The lives that we, all of us, build together in Christ, and the things we do and the things we create, that will be our evangelism. Just as the first Benedictines were a sign of light and order to the darkness and chaos of the early Middle Ages, so must we be today in our own time. I'm not optimistic, but I am hopeful. What's the difference? The optimist thinks that everything is going to be just fine. He lacks a sense of tragedy. The hopeful man, by contrast, knows that things might go well or they might go very badly indeed. But no matter what happens, God is with us. If we unite our suffering to Christ's passion, then we have every reason to hope. This is why we Christians revere our martyrs. They testified to life by their death. This is a mystery that the world cannot understand, but it is at the heart of our life together as followers of Jesus Christ. 2 years ago, I was in Paris, having coffee with a well-known French intellectual. We spoke about the failures of liberalism today and the rise of Islam. We agreed that our civilization is in a grave crisis. Finally, I asked my friend, "Where do you find hope?" He looked at me and he said, "I have no hope." I told him, "I do have hope. My hope is in Jesus Christ. But please don't think that I'm saying that like a sentimental American TV evangelist. I'm not optimistic, but I am hopeful." And then I explained to my French friend the difference for a Christian between hope and optimism. Then I told the man a story. I told him that when I was 17 years old, I was sure that Christianity was nonsense. I was interested in art and literature and culture. I wanted to go to Paris to see the art museums and the places where Ernest Hemingway and the Lost Generation lived. My mom won a trip to Europe in a church contest and sent me. I was the only young person on a tourist bus full of elderly Americans. I did not care. I wanted to go to Paris. On the way to Paris from England, our bus stopped in a small provincial town about 1 hour outside the city. We were going to see a cathedral. How boring. Another church. But I went inside anyway, because I didn't want to sit on the bus for an hour waiting for the old people. Well, this old church was a cathedral of Chartres. Nothing in my life as an American teenager of the late 20th century prepared me for the glory of God as manifested in the stones and the glass of that Gothic cathedral. I stood in the nave overwhelmed by awe. Suddenly, I knew that God existed and that He wanted me. I had no defenses against that. What kind of God could inspire men of the 12th century, men whose names have been lost to history, to build a temple like that? Was that Christianity? I thought Christianity was only the middle class at prayer. This was something far, far greater and more mysterious. Now, I did not walk out of the Chartres Cathedral as a reconverted Christian, but I did leave the cathedral changed. After that, I was on a search for God. It ended 9 years later when I fully converted. But the first steps of that journey, though, happened when I walked out of that cathedral after meeting Jesus Christ at Chartres. The stones and the stained glass from the 12th century bore witness to the reality of Jesus Christ in a way that was so much more powerful than my 20th century doubt. We have nothing like these cathedrals in America, I told the philosopher in Paris, but you have them everywhere in Europe. Open your eyes. They send us a message. They are a portal into eternity. Now, he listened to me with respect, this philosopher, and then he said, "That's very nice for you Americans, but here in France, we believe that this life is all there is. When you're dead, you're dead. That's it." I didn't know what to say to him after that. He is a good man. I know his work, and he's an intelligent man, but he has closed his mind to the possibility of God and of transcendence. The great cathedrals of Europe, including Notre-Dame de Chartres and Notre-Dame de Paris, are nothing to men like that but monuments to a culture that has passed into history. To me, though, seeing this Chartres Cathedral with fresh eyes, I saw it as a sign. The modern world makes us blind to truths that Christians of earlier ages could see. But the witness of the cathedrals remain for those whose eyes are still open and searching. And not only the witness of the cathedrals, but the witness of a way of life. Today, we Christians should not seek to recreate the life of the Middle Ages, but rather the life of the early church. The rule of St. Benedict offers a practical way of life for all Christians based on Scripture and the experience of the early church. It's a path of great depth composed for spiritual athletes. But we ordinary believers who are not spiritual athletes can walk a version of it, and in doing so, we will recover our sacred story. We can, with the Lord's help, make these dry bones live again. This is the cathedral we are invited to build in our daily lives as a means of conversion for ourselves, as an evangelical witness for the world, and as an ark that allows us to ride out the great flood of liquid modernity. All of us saw on TV the burning of Notre Dame Cathedral. I believe that that too was a sign from God. It symbolizes the urgent crisis of Christianity and our civilization. The burning of Notre Dame was an apocalypse. It awakened us. It frightened us. But will it convert us? That is the burning question. I'll end by quoting from the prologue of the Rule of St. Benedict. St. Benedict wrote, "Let us get up then at long last, for the Scriptures rouse us when they say, 'It is high time for us to arise from sleep.' Let us open our eyes to the light that comes from God, and our ears to the voice from heaven that every day calls out this charge. If you hear his voice today, do not harden your hearts. And again, you that have ears to hear, listen to what the Spirit says to the churches." This was the call of St. Benedict to the people of the 6th century amid the ruins of Roman civilization. It is also the call of St. Benedict to the people of the 21st century amid the ruins of Christendom. It is the voice of hope. Believe it, love it, and live it. Thank you very much.
You just built a cathedral.
Yeah, I feel like an American TV evangelist now.
We have only. No. I saw you today with Vladimir Palko, your new friend, and I have to tell you that they understood each other even if when they were not speaking each other. They really shared something. Two questions. In many ways, from Tocqueville to Chesterton to Michael Novak with his Slovak origins, all of them and many others stressed that America has a soul of church. That religious identity is it's crucial for American nation and exceptionalism. Is it lost or transformed, or what happened?
That's a very important question. And reading Tocqueville today makes me worry about the future of our country, because mostly that religious sense has been lost, or rather it has been transformed by the experience of the 20th century, especially in the middle of the 20th century. It has been transformed by consumerism and individualism. We looked at one of the great events in American history, the civil rights movement of the 1960s. We don't like to talk about it today, our media don't, but that was a religious movement led by black preachers of the gospel. The language the civil rights protesters used was biblical language, and they could use that language to speak to the collective memory of the American people and to call us, especially we Southerners, out of our sin into repentance and to justice. Today, I don't think the civil rights movement could be possible, not in the same way, because we have lost that cultural memory. And this is the fault, in many ways, of us Christians. The experience of Christian faith in church has been mostly about feeling good, as I said, and as Christian Smith has said. Whenever I go to speak at colleges, Christian schools, both evangelical, Protestant, and Catholic, I always ask the professors there, what are you hearing in class? What worries you about what you're seeing? They always say they are so worried about the future of the faith because their students are good kids, but they come to them knowing nothing about the faith. I mean, not even basics. They are blank slates when they arrive in college. One evangelical professor said, we do our best to make up for what they never got as children from their families or their churches or their Christian schools, but you can only do so much in 4 years. It is like the loss of a civilization, because once you've lost that collective memory and that memory of something outside yourself that you have to answer to, I don't know how you recover.
Second question we cannot avoid. We are a largely Catholic nation, quite formally, but still the dominant religion is Catholicism. In last days, there are many articles opening the issue of a possible sex scandal in the church in Slovakia. How the sex scandals in the United States, in the US Catholic Church, changed the church and American society? What are the lessons?
Well, before I answer that question, I want to add something to your previous question. My son, my oldest son, is in college now, and he told me last week, Dad, I don't trust my generation to defend human rights. I said, why not? He said, because all of us, we can't think of politics in any way other than it gives us the freedom to do whatever we want. You know, there's no such thing as human dignity in this conception of politics. This is something that comes to us as an inheritance from Christianity. You lose Christianity, ultimately, you're going to lose what we know as human rights, and that's something to worry about. Now, to answer your very painful question about the sex scandal, it's not only how it has changed the American church, but it's also how it continues to change the church. The scandal in the United States broke open in the year 2002 with Boston. But it's important that what happened in Boston happened in the age of the internet, because that made it possible for Catholics and everybody else, especially journalists all over America and indeed the world, to learn what the bishops had been hiding for all these years. What happened was the progressive disillusionment of American Catholics with the institution. After the first wave of scandal in the early 2000s, a lot of Catholics were shaken by the scandal, but they trusted the bishops when the bishops said, we've learned our lesson, we fixed this. Well, last summer, the truth came out about Cardinal McCarrick, that he was abusing seminarians. This was something that I knew as a journalist in 2002, but I couldn't write about it because nobody who told me, they were priests, Nobody would go on the record. But this came out, and then the information from the investigation by in Pennsylvania came out that revealed terrible things about what priests have done. The church in America now, the institutional church, has almost no moral authority left, even among its own people. This is not making a large number of people leave the Catholic Church, though that happened to me back in 2006. But it does put a big challenge to people about what it means to be a Catholic in an age when you can't trust your bishops and even many priests to tell you the truth and do the right thing. We were talking earlier today about how Slovak Catholics should prepare if the scandal is going to come here. I would say, do what I failed to do myself, and this is one reason I lost my Catholic faith. Prepare yourself by deepening your prayer life. Deepen your commitment to confession. Deepen your commitment to serving people with your hands and with, in your community. Don't think that just because you have all the arguments in your head straight that your faith is going to be okay. That was a mistake I made until finally I couldn't believe anymore. Anyway, we could talk about this all night, but it is a constant source of turmoil in the American church. And I'm hearing lots of times from Catholic parents who say that they don't know what to say to their children anymore. Their children have learned to distrust the church before they've even learned to trust it.
Now I will ask questions that were raised by people here, but as an older person from, as we say, analog age here in Slovakia, I would prefer questions raised by hands because digital technology is always second. So please.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you all. It was very interesting and very inspirative, because without prayer and without serving to each other, there is no Christianity possible. But we here in Europe have a bit different experience like you have in America. We had here close to the Slovak borders in Auschwitz, something like 8 years ago, millions and millions of people have been killed, not just sexually abused, but literally killed in gas chamber because they have been Jews or they have been anti-fascists or something like that. Or in former Soviet Union, Russia, millions of Christians have been killed because just they have been Christians. And here in Slovakia, especially in the 50s, the seminaries have been closed, the bishops have been arrested, the religions have been forbidden, etc., etc. And there was a persecution, a very strong persecution, but it didn't hurt the church. The church survived it. And it's true there are some sexual scandals, but they have always been, not just now, also in the past. But we are coming from the generation, we knew these martyrs who have been in prisons, etc. And I think there is hope and there is a reason for optimism because Jesus Christ is the same in the past, now in the future, and he's not changing. So it's just, and the question is how to bring this optimism to these young people, because for us it's clear, but to bring this optimism, this faith, and this joy to be Christian to the young generation who is disappeared about the life in the church.
This is hopeful optimism. Go ahead.
Well, no, I thank you for saying that. That's a beautiful testimony. This is a question that I think of myself as a father of 3 kids. How to make sure that the love of Christ above everything is passed on to them. And the best way I think to do it is to live it out. We live in a time when young people don't have Christianity as their default story. You know, when I was a kid growing up, we didn't go to church very often, and the Methodist church was the church we didn't go to, because as far as my family was concerned, our Lord was a Methodist, and we don't have to go to church to know that we're Christian. Well, those days are over now. You know, people don't have that basic cultural assumption that Christianity is true. I think that, and they don't want to hear an argument for it. When I was 17 in 1984, I didn't want to hear an argument for it. I needed to see Christianity lived out in a way that was compelling. Now, for me, growing up as a non-observant Protestant in a small town in Louisiana, I didn't see this. I'm sure it was there, but I didn't see it. I thought Christianity was only the white Southern middle class at prayer, or it was a crazy TV evangelist. We had plenty of those in the 80s, and we still do. Neither one of those spoke to my heart. It took going to France and walking in this cathedral to be struck like on my road to Damascus moment. I think that this does happen to people even today, but young people today, but they need to be able to see it with their eyes and experience it in ways that fly beneath their defenses. I'll give you another very short example. My opening my eyes and my heart to Jesus Christ happened, it started at Chartres. It ended with my decision for conversion 9 years later after I met a priest, an old Monsignor. He was in his 90s in Louisiana. It was in my first job as a journalist. I was assigned to go interview him because before he became a priest, he was an artist, and a really good artist. I went to see him, and he was like Yoda. He was very short and very gentle. His face was glowing. It was astonishing. This man had something about him. And I asked him to tell me his story. He told a long story that I won't share with you here, but he had thrown his faith away. He had lost his faith in his college days at Yale University. But when he went back to Guatemala, his hometown in Central America, he kneeled to receive communion, a communion he didn't believe was real. There was a burst of light out of the communion, and he heard a voice say, "I have always loved you." Now, this old man is telling me this story of something that happened 50 years ago, and he starts to cry. He was crying in front of me. He didn't care about his dignity at all. It was as if it had happened that morning. And he told other miracle stories that led to his conversion and to his becoming a priest. I left his house thinking, that man has seen the Lord. I want what he has, and I don't care what it costs me. So there's your illustration right there. It started with seeing art and architecture built by faithful men. And it ended for me, the road to conversion, with seeing how this life-changing encounter with Christ was told by this witness, this old Monsignor living in an old person's home in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Anyway, these, I think, are the things that convert more than arguments.
Stevo asks you that there are probably countries that lost culture war already, or more or less. But there are countries that are fighting, and many institutions are not lost yet. Stevo believes Slovakia is such a case. And the question is, would you suggest another strategy for people like Stevo in Slovakia other than Benedict's option?
Well, no, because I want to sell books. I mean, no, I don't want to be cynical. No, seriously. If there is a different option, then I want to hear it, because I don't really care about selling books. I want, more than anything, to help save the church and to make a life possible, the life of the Christian faith possible for people in my country and in countries around the world. But I think that eventually this liquid modernity, if it hasn't reached Slovakia yet with full force, it's coming. And it's coming very, very fast. Since I've been here just a day and a half, I've talked to some young people who have given me examples of how it's coming here. And I talked to one friend of mine in Hungary, actually, a young Catholic in Hungary, who said that she worries about the future because everybody in her generation wants Hungary to be nothing more than Sweden. You know, they want all the wealth and the experiences of Western Europe, and they're even willing to put their faith aside for that. I hope that's not happening in Slovakia, and God bless you if you haven't lost that much. Fight to keep what you have. But now is the time to prepare yourself for a future that's going to be more difficult. Who is the guy we were talking about today, the priest who came from Croatia in the 40s? Kovich. I think you were telling me that Kovich prepared the people here of Slovakia through different circles for persecution. And because he did that, and there were other faithful people who did that in the underground church, he saved Slovakia, or the Lord saved Slovakia through him. Now is the time for the Kovich option. You know, if you're not going to do the Benedict option, do the Kovich option. Because the persecution, the challenge to the faith that people today face, it's not going to be like under communism. This is going to be a much softer thing. It will be more of a seduction away from the faith by wealth and materialism. And we shouldn't be so proud of ourselves to think it couldn't happen to us. It's happening to a lot of people in my country now, people who were raised in faithful families, who were raised going to church, but they ended up seeing church as nothing more than moralistic therapeutic deism or the Republican Party at prayer.
Last year, a journalist was killed in Slovakia, a young man, and his fiancée as well. And as a result, huge demonstrations took place. Prime Minister had to leave his office, and interim minister also had to leave his office. Government remained in position, but people changed in the government. And there was an ongoing debate between young Christians. Many of them organized rallies and demonstrations showing solidarity with murdered young people. And they were discussing among themselves whether or not to stress their religious beliefs on that demonstrations, whether or not to directly talk about God, whether or not to talk about strictly Christian values, for example, or what would you say to them, to this debate?
I say we have to do both. Vladimir Panko was telling me today that when they organized the candle demonstration, they weren't just asking for religious liberty, they were asking for civil rights for all Slovaks, all Czechoslovaks. In the same way, one of my heroes, Václav Benda, he insisted that the things that the dissidents were asking for was not just for the Christian people, but for everyone, because he saw it as a Catholic himself. He was the only Catholic in Václav Havel's circle, inner circle of dissidents. Benda saw his calling as a Christian, his vocation to defend the rights of everyone and to speak out to everyone. And this is something that is a personal challenge to me. It's easy to feel very isolated in the United States as a believing Christian, especially if you work, as I do, in media circles where some people don't really believe in God anymore, and people can have very strong prejudices against Christians. Some of them deserved, most of them not. But it's important for me. I feel challenged by Benda to always root my own belief and my own activism in the common good. But we can't cut ourselves off from, and cut off our witness from our faith. Someone was telling me here in Slovakia today that liberal secular politicians are happy for the church to do good works, to care for the poor, to feed them, to do things like that, but they don't want to hear the Jesus Christ part. We have to bring the Jesus Christ part in there. Pope Francis has said that himself. If the church is nothing but an NGO doing good works, then it's not the church.
There were some among those young people who are Catholics themselves, who went to a friend of mine who was a leader of that movement. He studied at a very Catholic college and had a good education, and he decided to strictly avoid his religious beliefs and Catholicism, and even avoid others speaking on the demonstration. What would you tell to such a person?
Well, I mean, I can't know the strategic. There may have been a good reason for that. I can't know the specifics about that situation, but I'm bothered by Christians who want to completely leave their Christianity out of it. I used to be this guy myself. When I first converted in the 1990s, I was very proud to be a Christian, but I was also living and working in Washington, D.C., where if you were too Christian, people judged you. And I was very, very aware in a town like Washington where your status matters so much. And I didn't want to be too openly Christian because I wanted to protect my ability to rise. I can understand that now that I'm more mature. I know why, as a man in his 20s, a young man in his 20s, I know why I did that. But I'm embarrassed by that. I wish I had been more outspoken. Because if people like me, they like what I have to say, they like being with me, then they must know that that whatever good is within me comes from Jesus Christ. I really believe that.
Two direct questions. You talked about stability in spirituality, and yet you converted. What a miracle, you converted to Eastern Orthodoxy. How isn't it against, Chile and Slavo asks, isn't it against stability in spirituality you stressed before?
Yes, it is. No, it is. I have to be honest about my own journey and my own weaknesses. When I converted to Catholicism, that was the first time I encountered Christianity in a serious way. I was a young adult. I became such a super Catholic. I was living in Washington at the time, and I was also a political conservative and a journalist. I felt I was on Team Novak, Team Newhouse, Team George Weigel, the neocon Catholics. I wanted to be part of that tribe, and I was very defensive of it. And I can remember I put Pope John Paul high up. I looked to him as a hero and as a spiritual father. And I also looked at to the institutional Catholic Church as something, as a solid rock. Now, the Catholic Church didn't tell me to make a hero out of it. I did that of my own because I wanted something to believe in. I embraced my Catholic identity and was willing to argue about the Catholic faith with anybody who wanted to talk to me about it. What I didn't do was pray as much as I should have. I never went to a soup kitchen to work with my hands to serve the poor. I thought I was doing the right thing by God when I was arguing about the church. And when I was, in 2001, before the scandal broke in Boston, I was working at the New York Post as a columnist and started writing about a sex abuse scandal in a parish in Manhattan. I interviewed a man, Father Thomas Doyle, a hero priest, who has spoken up for many years for victims of sex abuse. I interviewed him for a column I was writing. After the interview, Father Doyle said to me, "Listen, Rod, I have a personal word for you. I can tell that you're a very serious Catholic, and I want to warn you, if you keep writing about the scandal and you keep investigating it, you are going to go to places darker than you can imagine." I thought, oh, wow. I said, well, thank you for saying that, Father, but I have to keep writing about this because I'm a faithful Catholic, and I want the church to be cleansed. I want justice for the victims, and I'm a father. I have a little boy. I want the church to be clean for him. Father Tom said, good, good, I want you to do this, but I'm warning you, prepare yourself for the darkness. I didn't do it. I thought I was doing it. I thought because I had the faith straight in my head, all the arguments in place, that my faith was safe. Over the next 4 years, I saw things and learned things that I couldn't have imagined, the depth of the evil that was being done by bishops and priests. Not all of them, but many of them. And I kept telling myself, the sins of men do not take away from the truth. And that is true. That is a true principle. But it finally got to the point when I didn't have the strength to believe anymore, that my salvation depended on being a Catholic. One of the things that happened was my wife and I discovered that a priest we were getting close to in Texas was in fact an abuser or an accused abuser. We thought that we couldn't be fooled. We could see these guys coming. We didn't see him coming. When I told my wife, I said, let me tell you about Father Chris, what I've just learned. She fell onto the ground crying. We had 3 kids by then. She said, we can never trust them again around our kids. something died in me and in my wife at that point. We just couldn't believe as Catholics anymore. We went to an Orthodox church, and we were living in Texas then. We went to an Orthodox church because from a Catholic point of view, the Orthodox have valid sacraments. We didn't intend to convert. We just wanted to worship Christ in the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist, even though we couldn't receive, and just to be at peace on a Sunday morning. Eventually, we decided to make that conversion. I'm proud to be an Orthodox Christian. I thank God for giving me Orthodox Christianity, but God has allowed me to learn an important lesson, and I want to share this with you Catholics and Protestants and anybody else here, even Orthodox. If you are the kind of Christian that I was before, a very prideful, intellectual Christian, then your faith is in more danger than you realize, especially from the scandal. If you have so much faith in the institution that you don't even think about it, you just think that it's always going to be okay, you're in danger. God broke me in my intellectual pride. This isn't the Catholic Church's fault. That's my fault. When I went into Orthodoxy, I went in as a shipwrecked man. And I don't believe the Orthodox Church is free from sin. I don't believe any church is free from sin. But what I have done as an Orthodox Christian is to regain my love for the Catholic Church. I want to try to be an encouragement to my Catholic brothers and sisters, even as I am a faithful Orthodox Christian. And I've done my best to repent of my pride and to learn to serve the Lord and to pray, to not get so caught up in arguing over which bishops are good, which bishops are bad, what are the rational arguments. Rational arguments are fine. That's not what I needed. That was my downfall.
Things you described sounds to me like scenes from that movie with Nicolas Cage, 8 millimeters. Horrified. There are quite a few questions about your orthodoxy. Let me put it this way. Eastern Orthodoxy has a special relationship with state, from harmony in ideal theory to collaboration in quite often practice. How do you survive with this?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. When I survived with it by, first of all, not doing what I did as a Catholic, which was to so identify with the institution that I couldn't handle the revelation of great sin among the priests and the bishops. I know the stories about the Orthodox Church, and I believe that most of them are true. But I choose to focus on my own repentance. Fortunately, in the United States, the Orthodox Church is very small, and we're very far away from a lot of these problems. But I know it can always happen in our church, too. So I focus mostly on serving my local parish, on keeping my eyes focused on the Lord and the Eucharist. If I see something wrong, I'm going to say something. You better believe that. But I don't place the bishops in the institution on such a high level. I believe our Lord founded the church for a reason. I believe that bishops are, the episcopacy, the bishops are ordained by God. But I worship Jesus Christ, not them. The mistake I made as a Catholic was, and I didn't know this, I concealed this from myself, was worshiping the institution. I'll tell you, my most shameful experience as a Catholic came in Jerusalem. My newspaper, the New York Post, sent me to Jerusalem to cover John Paul's pilgrimage to the Holy Land. And it was an incredibly moving time to be in the Holy Land with John Paul. One day I was with the other journalist in the courtyard of the headquarters of the Catholic Church in the Holy Land, and we were waiting for the Pope's motorcade to come from Bethlehem. And I saw on the other side of the courtyard, about as far as from here to the back of the room, an American Cardinal. And I said, oh, he's one of the good ones. He's a conservative. I'm going to go over there and introduce myself to him. And I'm going to kiss his ring, because I'm not like those bad liberal Catholics who won't kiss a cardinal's ring. No, I'm a good conservative Catholic. So I went over there, I knelt down and kissed his ring, and I felt so proud of myself showing my piety. This was Cardinal Bernard Law, the Archbishop of Boston. 2 years later, I found out the truth about what he was doing. And look, there's nothing wrong with kissing the ring of a cardinal. You're honoring the office. But there is everything wrong with doing it for the reasons I did it, which was to honor myself and to say, look at me, look at what a good Catholic I am. I'm not that kind of Orthodox Christian, please God. I don't want to be that kind of Orthodox Christian. I don't want to be around any kind of Christian who has that kind of piety. It was poison for me, and I'm just grateful to God that he allowed me to recover without losing my faith entirely, because I came very close.
Another question touches the issue of connection between Catholicism and national pride. There are nations like Ireland used to be a case, or Poland, and a few others where church is close to national pride. Sometimes it's nationalism, sometimes it's patriotism. How do you see this relationship between Catholic Universal Church and national pride? Can it help or hurt the church?
Well, it's a double-edged sword. I mean, in Orthodoxy, we see in the United States, sometimes converts are turned away because they go to an Orthodox church and it seems like the tribe at prayer. You know, you're not Greek, go away. You're not Russian, go away. Not all churches are that way, but many of them are. I think in that sense, the Orthodox Church could use more catholicity, a greater sense of our universal mission. But in the United States, the Catholic Church, you don't have that sense of nationalism, in part because we don't have the same history as Europeans. So I feel very uncomfortable telling Europeans they shouldn't have this nationalistic feeling about their faith. Clearly, that was something that was important for Poland and Poland's resistance to communism. But I think that we should be very, very careful not to forget that the gospel, that Jesus Christ did not die for the Greek people only. Jesus Christ did not die for the Slovak people only. He died for every man and woman. And I think that if we can find a sense of national unity in our faith, that can be good, but we can't let that overwhelm our sense of the universality of the faith.
Father Stefan asks you this question. Some Catholics are afraid to be in ghetto, to live in ghetto, others to lose their identity. According to Pope Benedict XVI, future of the Church is in creative minorities. How can we assure we are not a ghetto, but a leaven of mass? How can you comment this relationship to family? How do you comment this in relationship to family, education, academic, political work?
Oh, that's a complicated question. I think that today in the modern times, at least in the United States, we have much more danger from living without a community than we do from living in a ghetto. We need a community, a tight community, so we can be formed in the faith and be formed in our values, so that when we go out into the world, as we all must, we can faithfully represent Christ. You know, when I was in Norcia, which is what they call Nurcia, where St. Benedict is from, when I was in Norcia interviewing the monks there for my book, one of the monks was telling me about the importance of discipline and of having some time away from the world. He said, look, here in Norcia, we get thousands of pilgrims every year. They come here to pray, they come here for the Mass, some of them come here to hear the monks chant, and some of them come for spiritual direction. He said, we have to be very careful not to let the pilgrims and their needs interfere with the life of the monastery, because if we don't live by the rule, if we don't do our work, if we don't pray, have our time alone, our time in reading Scripture, then we cannot be for those pilgrims what God has called us to be as monks. The same principle works for lay Christians who don't live behind monastery walls. If we are going to be for the world who God calls us to be, then we have to shut out the world for some time in our week. Turn off the TV, put the smartphone down, spend some time in contemplation. The Christian life is work and prayer. I think that it's possible for the Christian life to become too ghettoized, to come to think that the line between good and evil is between us and them. As Solzhenitsyn told us, no, the line between good and evil runs right through the middle of every human heart. We have to always remember that. But the direction of modern culture in school and even in family life is towards fragmentation, towards isolation, towards loneliness. And I have to say, as Hannah Arendt, the great political scientist, said in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, the fertile ground in which totalitarianism grows is loneliness, is isolation. Václav Benda, my hero, said that he thought it was a great witness to God to go out into the world under communism and bring people together, his neighbors, to help them realize that they are part of a political community, whether they're Christian or not. Bring them together and to help rebuild a sense of community. That is a great challenge that we face even in freedom, because it doesn't matter if everybody is free, the family is free, but everybody is at home watching their separate TV show on their smartphone.
We have a question over there, please. Oh, I didn't saw anyone. I saw you first, and then we'll be second, please. You can shout.
So thank you for those provoking thoughts. So that provoked me to two questions. First, and I ask this with compassion, and it should be So the first question, and I mean personally, it's a question coming from compassion. I mean, it's still about your conversion, and my question is, to put this as honestly as I can, was it a conversion due to mistakes that the Catholic Church actually did in terms of the theological, doctrinal, philosophical? Because I see, you know, the disappointment, the shock, the terror, the sorrow, and all these things, which are, I mean, on a personal level, completely understandable. But then it just somehow leads to the question, well, what if the same thing happens in the Orthodox Church, right? I mean, I think not to frame this as the battle of theologians, like is David Bentley Hart a better theologian than Benedict XVI, right? But I mean, what if this happens in the Orthodox Church? So that's question number one. Secondly, you framed your strategy somehow similar to Benedict XVI's Via Pulchritudinis, right? So lead with the beauty. And I really appreciate an approach. My question here is simply, is it enough, right? I mean, this is something that Bishop Barron does in the States, right? The documentary, The Catholicism, that's showing the beauty of the church to attract, to evangelize. But we still see the beauty as the concept which assumes some kind of a rational disposition. So there is this understanding of beauty. Though there is this kind of beauty as we are struck by, mesmerized by, some kind of a sublime, but still beauty is something to be understood. So would you say that this strategy, the Benedict option of leading by beauty, also needs some kind of a rational underpinning? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for those questions. I'll answer the second one first, but I think the two are related. When I was 17 years old and in that cathedral, I had no aesthetic theory for what happened. I was overwhelmed by what I saw, and I knew, not in a strictly rational way, I just knew that God existed. I can't ultimately defend that, but what I can, in a sense of laying it out as an argument, but what I can tell you is I was changed by what I saw, and I couldn't forget what I saw, and a seed was planted in my heart that later gave fruit in conversion. And I think we can easily overthink this. Beauty is not a foolproof way of evangelizing for everybody. There are people who will be more moved by seeing compassion and love, active love, or suffering, or courage. My point is simply that these things, both beauty and goodness made incarnate and manifest, they are signs that point to God, to an encounter with truth, a truth who, let's not forget, is not an argument,
not a proposition, but a person, Jesus Christ. But beauty and goodness made incarnate are just doorways that can break through our own intellectual blindness. Now, about the source of my conversion, look, as I've tried to say, part of it was problems in the Catholic Church, the lies, the corruption, and the mediocrity. Because if I had had a Catholic parish or was able to find a parish where faith was strong, the priests seemed to really believe and there was inspiration, maybe I would have found what it took to hold on. But I didn't find that. Part of it was my own failure. I can remember, I think I told you this story today, or told someone, when I was first interested in Catholicism, I was in my first job as a journalist in my early 20s. A woman at my newspaper was a photographer. She said, "Oh, you're thinking of becoming a Catholic? Well, I'm a Catholic. Why don't you come work with me this weekend at the Missionaries of Charity Soup Kitchen?" And I thought, that sounds very Catholic. I'll do it. I love Mother Teresa. So I went to this soup kitchen on a Saturday. I spent the afternoon peeling potatoes, scrubbing pots. And when it was over, I thought, well, I guess that was okay, but really I'm more of an intellectual. My time would be better spent reading books. I never went back to the soup kitchen. And never, after I became a Catholic, never did I do anything like that. Years later, when my faith was broken, I had to reflect, if I had done more things like go into the soup kitchen, simple things with my hands, would my faith have been strong enough? Would it have been rooted in my heart strong enough for me to withstand this crisis of faith because of the failures in the Catholic Church? That was a failure of myself. That was a failure of myself to take conversion seriously. I thought I was fully converted because my mind was made up. In fact, my heart was not converted. I prayed to God. I don't want to assume that my faith would survive a similar crisis in the Orthodox Church, but I hope I've spent the last 13 years as an Orthodox Christian in serious repentance and to help allow the Church and my prayer life to form me in a way where I don't set myself up so pridefully to think that my faith could withstand anything. And because the Orthodox Church is not perfect, I'm sure that if we saw what was really going on behind the scenes, we would be shocked. We're just fortunate in the U.S. that the Orthodox Church is so small that we haven't had our sins made public like the Catholics have. But I'm not under any illusion that the Orthodox Church is free of sin. Please don't get that idea. What I can do with myself is prepare my own heart through prayer and fasting and humility, not to be as arrogant as I was as a Catholic. That was my fault, not the Catholic Church's fault. And there are Orthodox Christians and Protestants who are just as dangerous or in just as perilous a situation as I once was because of their own pride.
We mentioned today an example or a life of a Slovak living in America, Jaroslav Pelikan, who also converted to Orthodoxy. So there are some Slovaks who understand you. Don't be afraid. There was one question about modern art. You talk about beauty, about aesthetics. Did you find interesting modern art that fits to the churches, for example?
No.
That's a mistake.
Sorry.
No, please. Do not be ignorant, please.
No, I'm not trying to be facetious or flippant. I don't understand modern art. I don't want to be a Philistine and say it's all ugly. I just don't relate to it.
Next time you'll be here, I have to take you to an exhibition because we have a great Slovak painters and sculptors in 20th century, great ones. There was a question in the back, please.
Hi, Rod. I'm a Catholic priest. My name is Juraj Vitek, and I'm an Oratorian priest. Thank you for your book. When I was reading it, I found it very inspiring, and I can say that I can share many things, many accents you mention in your book. But honestly, I missed something. I'm very glad you found out Saint Benedict. But when I was reading about the time of Renaissance, I thought about Saint Philip. I'm following.
Right.
And I think that Saint Philip Neri made a Benedict option in the time of Renaissance. And then when I was in Rome, I was studying in Rome. I've been studying in Rome for 8 years. I found out the theology of sense. And I think that it would be very, very important to find out other sense also, because Saint Benedict is very, very great. But I think that he is only one color of the light of Christ. I have been studying many saints in these 20 years, and it's not. I have to introduce it. My first question is: do you know deeply any other saint of Catholic Church beside Saint Benedict? And the second question, it's not question, I say it in spirit of friendship in God, that I think that for me, for example, theology of sense was a great source of Christ's light. Also considering the church as institution. For example, St. Catherine of Siena. To me personally, it helped a lot. And I invite you to find out theology of sense. And the last question, what do you think about Pope Francis' option?
Well, now you could say what is it, to be more concrete. What is the Pope Francis option? I mean it in a friendly atmosphere. Not too many sentences, but be a little bit more concrete.
It's included in my question. If Rod Dreher knows the Pope Francis option.
Okay. I'll try to be succinct. I chose St. Benedict because of Alistair MacIntyre, the philosopher who wrote his book After Virtue before his conversion to Catholicism. In the early 1980s, he wrote this book. And I chose Benedict because he said at the last line of his book was, we await a new and doubtless very different St. Benedict. This came at the end of a book in which he was talking about the disintegration of the Western tradition. I don't think MacIntyre at that time was talking about a religious conversion, but he was talking about the need for people, charismatic people, to arise out of this chaos and provide a way, a disciplined and compelling way of life to allow people to live together through this chaos in a way that was life-giving and orderly. And that was my starting point. MacIntyre said in his final paragraph that people have a choice. Some people in Benedict's time chose to continue to try to save Rome. But people like Benedict, said MacIntyre, wanted instead, they didn't want to save Rome, they wanted instead to find new ways of serving God in community. And so they were creative minorities. I asked the question of myself, what would a Saint Benedict of the 21st century have to say to us? How would he live? My book, The Benedict Option, it does not give a full answer, but what I did was go talk to different people, Catholics, Orthodox, and Protestants, people who are trying to find a way to live faithfully in community in this disintegrating post-Christian order. That's where St. Benedict came from. G.K. Chesterton, in his biography of St. Francis, wrote about how God will send saints that each age needs. St. Benedict was a saint of gathering things in, gathering spiritual energies in after they had been lost in the fall of Rome. After a few centuries, those spiritual energies were so concentrated that the church needed a St. Francis and a St. Dominic, for that matter, to take those energies and spread them throughout society. Now, these are kind of cartoonish explanations, but I think Chesterton was on to something important. I think today we live in a time, another time, of gathering energies in, spiritual energies in. That's why I think St. Benedict is particularly important for this time. But of course, there are many kinds of saints, and we have many saints in the Orthodox Church too. It's not a one-size-fits-all. About Pope Francis, I'm going to be careful because I'm not a Catholic anymore. I was very moved by Pope Benedict. I look at him as a spiritual hero of mine, and it's even a spiritual father, though I'm no longer Catholic. I worry about Pope Francis that he is losing focus on losing sight of some of the things that the church needs to do today. But again, I'm not Catholic. I don't want to criticize him too much. But the Pope that I still look to for inspiration is Pope Benedict. I do, however, love what Francis says about evangelism. But I think what Pope Francis and his supporters are missing is, as I said in my talk, we can't give the world what we don't have. If we don't know the faith deeply, then how can we spread it to the margins? I think that it's not a question of either or. Either we study our catechism or we evangelize. To be faithfully Christian, we have to do both. But nobody can doubt that we live in the West in a time when we have lost so much knowledge of the faith, and so many of the habits of mind and of the heart of the faith, that we first need to convince our own hearts and to tell ourselves the Christian story before we can tell it to the world.
Last 3 questions, and I will answer 2 of them.
Good.
There are many questions raised that you can find answers here in this book published by Best Internet Daily, I know. And
oh, I'm sorry. We do want to serve books. We do want to sell them.
It's okay. I can say it. It's all right. Second, there are a few questions about how to live Benedict option in a city, in towns. I'm sure you would call it Václav Benda option. So let's consider this to be answered. And last question is. Somebody from audience asked you about how do you, if you know the leaders of our underground church from communism, and what do you think of them? So tell us how you heard something today. So what did examples told you, and how are you maybe impressed?
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad you asked that question, because the book that I've just started working on is going to be looking for stories of the underground church in the communist world, in Slovakia, but also other communist countries, talking to members of that church about their experiences under communism, and trying to gain wisdom that we who live in the United States and under Western liberal democracies, to gain experience or wisdom that we can use to hold on to our faith amid challenges that are now coming. I was told 5 years ago by a friend of mine whose mother spent 6 years in a Czechoslovak prison as a political prisoner because she was Catholic. She's very old now. She lives in America. She told my friend that she's starting to see signs in the United States that remind her of her youth when communism first came to Czechoslovakia. And I thought that was really shocking. So I asked a Hungarian emigre friend who lives in the UK. I said, this old Czech woman says this, is it true? He said, absolutely. We see it here in the UK. The way political correctness is forcing people who, if you don't share all their ideology, they will try to ruin you professionally and personally. Ever since that 5 years ago, every time I meet somebody in the US who grew up under communism, I ask them, are you seeing things now in this country that remind you of your youth in communism? Every one of them says yes, and we can't get Americans to see it. The purpose of my book is to help us Americans to see it, to see what's happening now, this coming of a new soft totalitarianism. I think my experience today talking, and last night talking with members of the underground church, and my experiences that I will have later this week, because my hosts here at the Hanusove have arranged an amazing schedule for me to listen to the testimony of the underground church. This is going to be incredibly valuable information and witness for people like me and my fellow Americans, because we don't think that anything like this can happen in our country. This is something for Russia. This is something for Eastern Europe. Solzhenitsyn warned. He said, this is the great mistake people can make, to think it can't happen here. He said, what happened to us in Russia can happen to every country on earth. It won't happen in the same way, but it could still happen. And so I'm grateful to you Slovaks, and especially the members of the underground church, for your stories, because we have so much to learn from you. And thank you for hosting me, and thank you for coming here, and thank you for your stories, and I hope we can learn.
I met many Americans during last decades coming here, and thank God they came teach many interesting lessons us. But you are the first one who came here to ask and listen. Ladies and gentlemen, Rod Dreher.
Thank you.